I'll never forget that day. The sun was shining. I had just delivered a beautiful boy child. Mother and baby were happily getting to know one another while I cleaned up when there was a knock at the door. It was Esther, the neighbor girl, who often did odd jobs for the midwives. She had a message from Shiphrah that said that I should come home as quickly as possible. Shiphrah was my mentor, my friend. She was the reason that I had become a midwife in the first place. She had attended to my mother on the day of my sister's birth. And without her care and her skill, neither of them would be alive still. I was only 7 years old then, but I knew in that moment that I wanted to do the same. And so as soon as I was old enough, I approached Shiphrah and asked if she would take me on as an apprentice. Thankfully, she agreed. And I have now been a full midwife myself for 2 years. I'll soon be looking to take on apprentices of my own. At Esther's words, I took a quick glance back at mother and baby to assure myself that they really were well, and quickly gathered my things and headed home. I was surprised when I arrived to find a soldier of Pharaoh's army standing in the courtyard, but he didn't try to stop me, and he simply just nodded as I went in, searching for Shiphrah in the small house that we shared. It didn't take much to realize that the old woman was worried as she paced the floor back and forth. When she saw me, she came over and took my hands in hers and whispered quietly, "Puah, we have been summoned by Pharaoh. We are to report immediately." I admit my heart did its own little leap at that news. It was not normal for us to be summoned by the highest authority in the land, the one that the Egyptians believed was a god on earth. Although we were midwives and that position came with its own authority, we were still women, and Hebrew women at that. It was not normal for us to be called. It was not going to be a social call, of that we were sure, although there was a slight chance that one of the women of the royal household was in need of our services as midwives. I pretty quickly dismissed that thought, though, because the soldier would have said so when he arrived, and Shiphrah would not look so worried if that were the case. They'd also most likely be using their own Egyptian midwives and would not call for us. So all we knew was that we had been summoned and we must go. So we gathered up our bags on the off chance that we would need them, and with bags in one hand and each other in the other, we walked quickly behind the soldier on the way to the palace. When we arrived, we were announced before Pharaoh and bowed low to the ground as we had been taught. When he told us to rise, he spoke to Shiphrah, saying, "You are Shiphrah, the one the Hebrew midwives call their mother and mentor?" "Yes, my lord," Shiphrah responded, still with her eyes downcast. "And this is Puah, previously my apprentice and now my colleague in our sacred work." I, for my part, said nothing, tried to look dutifully humble. Pharaoh seemed pleased with her words, as if he had gotten the right people. "Wonderful," he said. "I have an edict that you must give to your daughters and to those of your guild. When you act as midwives for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, she may live." I couldn't believe my ears. I just barely managed to contain my gasp of surprise and horror at this gruesome pronouncement from the king. But Shiphrah simply said, "I understand, my lord," and we were quickly dismissed from Pharaoh's presence. We walked home in silence, but when we were safely again within our own walls, I Oh, I couldn't contain myself any longer. I went off. How dare he, I yelled. How dare he ask those of us who are tasked with bringing life into this world and saving it to purposely blot it from the face of the earth? How dare he? How could he possibly think that we would go along with this horrific scheme of his? And you, I changed my voice, turned my anger to Shiphrah. You can't be serious that you would pass along this scheme of his. I am ashamed. My God, I am ashamed to be your apprentice. And with that, I saw Shiphrah's face fall. My words stumbled to a halt. Are you finished? She asked quietly. When I nodded, she continued as if she was teaching me on my very first day in her service. Life is sacred, Puah. It is a midwife's duty to stand in the breach between life and death and coax life into being. Sometimes death is a part of that experience, and when it comes, we mourn and pray. But it will not come at our hand. But you said, I started before she cut me off, but nothing, Puah. I only told the Pharaoh what he wanted to hear. We will spread the word of his order, but we will not follow it. It will be dangerous, and it will require the cooperation and courage of every woman in our guild. But we cannot break our oath before God or our duty to the women we serve. That night, we stayed up all night. We made plans into the wee hours of the morning, and with first light, our messages started going out to every midwife in the land of Goshen. It would now be our practice to leave the items necessary for a safe and successful birth with our patients in the days and weeks leading up to her labor. Then, when it was time, neighbor women could help the expectant mother to deliver safely and not call on us. Of course, if mother or baby were in distress, we would absolutely be there, and consequences and Pharaoh's order be damned. But this way, we could safely tell Pharaoh that we were not present at the birth of any boy child of Hebrew descent. We knew that this order was coming out of Pharaoh's fear of our people. That's why he had put us into slavery in the first place. And so we knew that he wanted us to make it seem as if the deaths were an accident of the labor process, so as not to raise the ire of the Hebrew people. His plan would not work if we killed the child after he had latched successfully to his mother's breast. And so if we arrived after the birth, we could care for both mother and child, but we would be safe from Pharaoh's wrath as well. Of course, we worried. We worried day and night, both for our patients and for ourselves, if Pharaoh found out about our trickery. But we could not let that stop us from following the greater command of our God. It was a day very different than the first visit of Pharaoh's soldiers. It was pouring rain and gray that day when the soldier arrived once again in the courtyard. Shiphrah and I looked at each other. We knew this day was coming, but neither of us had been looking forward to it. When we were announced into Pharaoh's presence again, the air was heavier, and there was a bite to Pharaoh's voice when he asked us why the Hebrew boys still lived. I've never been more grateful to be the junior midwife than I was when I stood there beside Shiphrah, listening to her explain to Pharaoh that the Hebrew women were more vigorous than the Egyptian women, and they did not require our services as often in order to have a safe delivery. My heart sank when Pharaoh spoke again after Shiphrah's words. giving up any previous pretense of subtlety that he might have had. He said simply, if you cannot follow my orders, then I will find someone who can. My soldiers will go out throughout the entire land today and in the days to come. Any male child that is born of a Hebrew woman, whether he be dead or have breath in his lungs, will be thrown into the Nile. Every girl child, she may live. With that, he dismissed us again. And Shiphrah and I held back our tears as we walked home. There was great wailing in Egypt in those next years as Pharaoh's soldiers sought out the newborn boys of our community and took them from their mother's arms. Some parents refused to be separated from their children, and so they were thrown into the Nile right along with them, or beaten severely as punishment. Shiphrah and I watched, knowing that there was nothing that we could do. We had done all that we could. Occasionally, we would be able to help a mother hide her male child. But eventually, inevitably, that child grew too old and too big to be hidden. And Pharaoh's soldiers found him, and the same thing happened. Except for the one named Moses, who eventually came to lead our people. I'm an old woman now, older even than Shiphrah was then. And I give thanks every day that I have lived to see the liberation of my people. But I also grieve. I still grieve for the lives ended at Pharaoh's command. The cries of the children cry out from the Nile, waiting, screaming to be heard. We are free from Egypt's bondage, but our wounds will take much longer to heal. And so I tell you my story so that you might know of the courage of my mother Shiphrah and my sister Midwives, so that our stories are not lost to time. I tell you of those days so that you will know that sometimes we cannot prevent all the evil of the world, but that we must do our part when we can. I tell you of this part of our history so that never again will you let it be done that children are ripped from the arms of their mother and placed into the arms of death. I tell you my story so that you may live it out in your own life and pass it on into the lives of your children.